Everyone for coming back together. I think the most exciting part of these kinds of workshops and events are not only kind of working with the people in your group and understanding the perspectives and thoughts and ideas of those around you, but also the people in other groups. And so now we'll come together and start with group one to essentially have their spokesperson lead, share their ideas and thoughts, and aim for about a minute or two to kind of go through that.
Okay, so we are group one. In the first case, so the misalignment is between the first and the second case is actually who is being served. So in the first case, the physician charting time is reduced by 4%, but the physicians report that they are spending less time with their patients because the system rewards the throughput. And then in the second case, the team is connecting people to social services that has demonstrated a 23% reduction in ED visits. And so the misalignment is between who is being served. And in the first, the system is being rewarded, and then in the second, the actual patients and the patient outcomes are what is translating. And we discussed how in the second case, they do have the metrics to gain funding, but there's a certain language that needs to be used to appeal to investors. So the second team's case could be referring to leverage that language to get the financial support that they need. And then if any of my teammates want to chime in.
No, it's super insightful, and I think the language part is really interesting, right? Because learning how to convey ideas in ways that are appealing to others is definitely a core component of getting buy-in into your ideas beyond what the value is. Oftentimes, there's also the layer of how do I communicate value and the worth. So I love that you guys brought that up. I think it's super insightful. We'll move on to group two.
Hey folks, I'm Dan. Nice to meet you all. Group two, we got...
You need to speak louder because...
oh yeah, I'm sorry. Hi everybody. Group two, thank you, Leo. We got really philosophical, I guess, about it and kind of went in a bit of a different direction. So we started from a question of how long should a company live and should all companies survive? And we sort of used the model of apoptosis, right? So some cells die on purpose at certain times when they've completed their mission, so to speak. And if no cells die, then you get problems. You have cancer of one sort or another. So we tried to ask a question of if you had, what would it look like if you only invested in companies that you knew would last 1,000 years? What types of companies would that produce? Versus if you allowed some companies to fail, what types of companies would that produce? That drifted us a bit into alternative funding mechanisms and how VC is designed to fund a certain type of company and a certain thing, which might or might not be the thing that the community needs or wants. So we thought about other things like government grants, and we thought about crowdsourcing and organic growth as sort of other tools. And eventually we kind of had this idea of, if you give everybody a tool, somebody with a chisel will make a different piece of art than somebody with a paintbrush. And neither of those are wrong necessarily, but they'll produce different types of outcomes. So we had lots of really good ideas about how to make company B more successful, but ultimately, I think what we ended on is like, how do we decide how long a team or a company should stay together and what does success look like? To which we raised one really important counterexample, which is lots of companies fulfill their mission and then turn into something else that is even better afterwards, or potentially even worse. And that's, yeah. Did I miss anything there, guys? Anything else y'all want to add to that? No, great.
Yeah, and I love the kind of reflection about the duration. And we're talking about systems of power kind of in place that are monolithic, that have been there for ages. And now, as we reimagine, it's like not only understanding and recognizing and calling them out, but also like we should build more structures that are also going to do the same exact thing, because that then becomes more systems that are going to play us 50 years down the line, or 5 years down the line in the AI accelerated world. We'll go to group three.
That's me. Hi, Julie. Group three, we had some great discussion about the whole person and what is really health of the whole person. So we found this adjusted life years and understanding where the trade-offs are ethically. If you knew you might have some sort of condition like diabetes, if you knew that could lead to losing your foot, for example, would you make different decisions, right? So the community pulse is really upstream, right? Trying to solve the societal issues that are there and giving relief to the ER workers, right? But we have to know why. Why is this person doing that, right? And what health are they having? And then on the other side is the actual MedFlow AI, right? So they're being funded by the, and doctors are reducing time with patients. So in my world of social science, we look at, well, is that a good thing? Do they get more relief from being with patients? Can they do their charts? There's not always a negative impact to that, so that maybe billing is more efficient, we don't need as many accountants. There's a lot of like human impact that could help the system, which is kind of overburdened right now. So we talked about some funding streams, patients, the people, and also like just how the inflow of people needing social services is so great, and why is the ER visit such a difficult, or getting so many people? Because if we think about that, then there's other services like social services that might need to take care of that.
Does anyone else want to chime in onto that? Great. And that's super interesting because we start to think about in like the health policy landscape, for example. One of the things that gets brought up is what policy is health policy, and where do we draw that line?
Right.
So when you start thinking about healthcare and what problems are healthcare problems, and where do we draw that line? And oftentimes the problems we see in healthcare are kind of symptoms of like a deeper societal level issue that are oftentimes more challenging to grapple with and not as tangible and easy to address. And I think that involves bringing together people that are outside of healthcare, outside of our typical groups or circles, to engage in conversations, to understand what that really looks like. So that's super interesting. Jump to group 4.
So in our group, we had a couple of points, actually a couple of points on but one thing is, again, following back on what you were mentioning, is that AI documentation tools promise to reduce burnout, but the political economy of hospital really negates that benefit because they increase workload for physicians. So that's like a keep perpetuating. And so the question becomes, it's a myth that, do we put in the agreements that by providing clinicians, AI scribes or tools, do they get that extra time back, or do they need to see more patients? And that can clearly tell you and show metrics that, their schedules are not getting any easier. Now, the way AI scribes got to be sold and scripted, the language itself and the narrative has a really powerful impact. It was first time seeing that AI scribes, because of how hospitals wanted to be AI adopters and wanted a safe use case to be using that in, they saw AI scribes as a potential use case. Funding came in to push for AI scribes. And the real argument was, studies is going to show how this tool is improving and reducing time. Studies actually have shown that AI scribes do not reduce time efficiency or improve time efficiency, very marginal. But what happened that have made hospitals invest in is the narrative, that physicians have really rated this highly, and the AAMC and all of the narratives on physician burnout has supported that. What made this also being sold out was patients' perspective, where I'm displaying on dashboards in hospitals the feedback from patients on how they perceived. And to your point, that could really have a real impact if we're really conducting this in a meaningful way and asking the right question to really measure whether these tools are translating to clinical patient outcome improvements or just workflow improvements, which is, I think, the misalignment here. Hospitals needs to be measured on outcomes for patients and not on satisfaction rates.
Yeah, so then that led us to just talk about metrics as a whole. What are we incentivizing? For the sides of both cases, whether instead of looking at, we can reframe we're going to reduce time by 40%, to let's make the metric instead, how much time is the physician spending in front of the computer? You can track the amount of typing time very easily on just using a line of code. You can say, okay, we can assume that if the physician isn't typing a lot, they're probably looking at their patient more so, interacting with them, getting time away. So instead of saying, we're gonna make the time per patient faster so that you can have more throughput, we're reframing what the tool already does and saying we're going to give more time between the patient and the clinician to speak. And so that also then led us to believe, why are we funding things that produce throughput? Are we looking at the wrong metrics? So not only is it on the burden of these companies starting out to have really appealing and fundable metrics to sell to VCs, to sell to grants, to sell to funders, can we also, instead of it only being our burden, to change what we're giving to the world as something that's beneficial and can be funded, can we instead change the views of the people giving the funding, having the power of who can provide grants? Can we get communities who are part of these, like in case B, can we get the people who are afflicted by these communities, can we give them power to choose who do these grants go to, which companies do we like, what problems do we have, is this company actually going to help my community because I'm affected by it? If so, can we have a say in where that money is going through, whether that's through governments, whether that's through VCs, etc. So there's both sides of, are we incentivizing funding to come in as a company, and also incentivizing who do we give the power of giving that money to and making those decisions of what is going to create impact for us. So yeah.
I was just gonna add, so the question is there a way to make the MedFlow AI work? And we said that maybe there's a contract between the hospital and the physicians that if we save you time, we're not gonna give you more patients to see. And then we talked about if only we had a physician union, then we can have an agreement that that's not going to happen. But of course, we don't have any physician union, so we don't have any leverage. And then about how can we find funding for Community Pulse? And we said that maybe, you know how big companies are getting tax cuts. Maybe the tax cuts are not the same for the different VCs and companies. Maybe there should be more tax cuts for those that are funding companies similar to Community Pulse. And then don't give tax cuts for the other types of firms. And then, of course, the question is, who decides what is the level of the tax cuts? And we said it has to be the community again. But at present, we don't have any infrastructure to support this.
So there is one mechanism that sort of acts like that, which is on the commercial banking side. So if you're a commercial bank and you receive deposits from a community, you're required to invest X amount of that money back into the community where your people that deposit with you live, right? And what it says is you're making money by banking for that community, so you have to give back to the people who are helping your business. So you could imagine something that sort of worked like that, right? Where there is the link between community funding and return to that community. But that's the only space I know of that actually functions like that. That's certainly imperfect, but it has some interesting features to it. It's used a lot, for example, to fund affordable housing developments in a certain district or things like that.
I think we need more brainstorming to come up with these ideas.
So we'll jump into group 5.
We're group 5. I'm Andrea, and I think there are a lot of excellent points raised already. And a lot of our discussion was kind of, I think, to echo a lot of the other groups focused on, like, you know, the profit motive does not seem well aligned with patient incentives. So for MedFlow, you know, they have a really clear path to profitability, whether that's actually the hospital increasing the number of patients that can be seen in one clinic, or just sort of the overall perception of the hospital is lifted by the adoption of AI. I think hospitals will buy the technology because they perceive that it improves the bottom line. Whether or not MedFlow is ethical or not, I think you could say, well, you know, if you make more clinicians see more patients, that might increase clinician burnout, but more patients might get seen, and maybe these are patients who would have to wait 3 weeks, and now they have to only wait 1 week for an appointment, so there might be some benefit there. For collecting data, that seems a little bit shady, but if you're using that data to do like rare disease research, and you're getting data that you otherwise wouldn't have access to, that could improve patient care. If you're using it to sort of like discriminate like who does or doesn't get approved for an insurance plan, that seems unethical. But at any rate, MedFlow seems to have a path to profitability, whereas our case B, the community, I forget what
Pulse.
Community Pulse. Community Pulse, obviously, it seems like, you know, it's a lot more aligned with patient benefit, but it didn't have that same clear path to profitability. So we were exploring some other like funding mechanisms outside the beaten path of just like the typical VC pathway, such as family offices. They might have a little bit of a longer timeline to profitability that they're willing to wait with that company, versus maybe trying to go to a Kaiser sort of situation where the payer and the provider are the same, so the same entity has that incentive to drive down ED visits. Because an individual hospital probably isn't incentivized to have 23% less throughput in an ED, although an ED often isn't the most profitable part of the hospital, it would still be 23% of that billing that the hospital's losing out on. So I think it's careful consideration of who would benefit monetarily the most from Community Pulse to try to figure out where to get money so that can succeed to the benefit of patients. As a kind of sidebar, we also talked about, you know, if the profit motive is misaligned with the patient motive, is there a different like incentive structure that we could use? And people were talking about maybe we could have like outcomes-based reimbursement where we look at patient outcomes. And I just want to offer like one cautionary tale about that. So like Medicare won't reimburse hospital stays where people get central line associated bloodstream infections or urinary catheter associated urinary infections. And while that's good, you know, you want your hospital to be taking care of these things, and these are pretty avoidable, and you want to make sure everything is clean, and patient, you know, the hospital is doing everything that it can to like optimize care. You end up in these situations where you suspect that a patient with a central line has a bloodstream infection, and you want to test for it, and they won't let you. So I've ended up in fights over this before. I'm like, we can't just slam this patient with antibiotics for a presumed bloodstream infection. We need to see what it is. And I have like 12 administrators in the group chat with me being like, absolutely not, like do not do that. We will block it, not allowed. So I think sometimes when you have outcomes metrics, there are still ways to game the system because there is still a profit motive behind it. So
That's super insightful.
my axe to grind.
Yeah, and it's a trend. Go ahead.
Has anyone heard of city block health? So it seems like that's the version of the second startup, whereas unicorn, VC funded, profitable, and value-based, although it has the problems, the outcome-based thing. So just to counteract, I think the way that is framed, it seems like the second startup is worse when working in the space, the first one is highly commoditized. Like practically cloud can already do this without the compliance part. So I would argue the second one, if they start with non-clinical, they can build the clinical and then frankly do what the first one does. So it's, I feel like it's,
we talked about them
right?
pairing together.
Exactly.
One is making the money and the other one is spending it basically.
100%.
They need a sustainability.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So we'll now transition over to our virtual breakout group. And if you guys can project and share what your conversation was about.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shauna. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. We had really similar dialogue to what's already been discussed. MedFlow AI will win because what's incentivized is the payment, the capital. So MedFlow flows capital from the patients in the form of data. So we understood kind of their profit statement as they're monetizing patient data, which is such a big industry at the moment. And that's flowing capital to investors from patient data. Whereas Community Pulse is flowing capital back to the patient. So they're actually saving patients money, which doesn't do anything for the investors. And that's the problem. So we've all talked already about this. The incentive is the problem. Preventative care is not incentivized. We talked about examples of it being incentivized, already been named Kaiser Permanente, and then MIPS, so Medicare's merit-based incentive payment program. Obviously new, lots of problems, a lot of, it was kind of presented as a larger package than it ended up being able to pass as, but those are two kind of ways to incentivize this care. So maybe Community Pulse could partner with KP or MIPS because they're outcomes based. We also talked about the inherent issue of monetizing patient data. And myself and Dr. Katia both work on the topic of data sovereignty, making patients both aware and having more power to own their own data, so it's not sold and monetized back to pharmaceutical companies or whoever the buyers are. And Katia talked a little bit about data donation. What if it wasn't monetized, selling the patient data back in the form of money back to patients, or having the patients being the ones paid for when the data is monetized? What if it's reciprocated in a different way, like paying for your Uber or paying for the next kind of preventative care case? So a couple ideas around incentivizing value. And that's kind of where we ended up, just ideating, no great solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging to find solutions, and there's so much complexity to what's going on. And I think that's the tension that we're kind of grappling with. And the points about data are absolutely really interesting. And data is a means of kind of seeking revenue and controlling power in a sense. And so I wonder kind of what we could do to help communities have ownership of their data and thus translate that into power and say and kind of the conversations that occur. And so I guess like if we were to change the kind of paradigm of who decides to fund companies, and so if we shifted away from the typical funders and communities were involved in making those decisions, what would that look like? And what do you think would change as a result of that for both good and bad?
I think you would see a lot more startups where there were immediate tangible benefits to patient communities. So if you could say, this will help you with this task or that task, I think there would be a lot of interest in like community pulse type startups. I think for companies that have a longer, like a clearer path to profitability, but the benefit is more intangible and more in the future, I think those would have a more difficult time getting funded through more of a community mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to like the clinical, translational versus basic science, and you need a lot of like government grants because we anticipate maybe 1 out of 100 of these in 20 years will like yield the next Ozempic or whatever.
That has me thinking about like what we consider as a startup, and that if we start to kind of expand our thinking a little bit on what a startup is, because the term very much has connotations of what technology for explosive growth, right? But if we're starting to kind of reimagine, well, if we start from more of a community-based relational ecosystem that is a much less commoditized, much actually bigger moat, and then make that transition later, that there's something very, very powerful in that. But if we're not expanding our thinking about what a startup could be or what a startup is in the very early stages, almost like embryonic stage, then we miss those opportunities to build something that with technology on board is truly impactful, that includes the community. Because like all of those kind of in the embryonic stage, they either, like in our example, like second example, Community Pulse, they either die off or they stay siloed and not scalable. So it just had me thinking about just reframing what startups are, and if we start to expand our thinking about what a startup in the early stage is, before the kind of technology comes on board to scale, then all of a sudden we have a much more expansive ecosystem where builders and students and builders can now access, like, oh wow, there's a huge world of very impactful, amazing ideas, community-based, already established relationships, already established ecosystems with patients and communities that we can build with now.
I think just to add a point, I had a thought of like, we never see, we always VCs measure startup success with how many clients, with how many access or impact they're able to create in revenue. But one question, can VCs improve their chance of investing in the right model go to a VC and say we want to fund this. But with AI and software, much of the paradigm is iterate quickly, have something, scale with showing the number of clients, but maybe switching the narrative to focus on community evaluation and community impact or quantifiable outcomes is actually the real metric for VCs to invest in startups.
I think it's also worth saying that like we're sort of discussing this community pulse one as if it's failing, right? Because it's not growing. But this is a group that took in $150,000 and produced a 20% reduction in ER visits. So I'm an ER doctor. Nothing produces a 20%. That is the most wildly successful intervention I've ever heard of under any circumstance, right? This is the best thing that's ever happened. We should immediately give them another $150,000. But that doesn't mean they now have to become a unicorn, and it doesn't mean that they now have to fail. It is totally fine to produce a point solution that creates an impact for people, right? So that doesn't mean that it has to be a startup, and to your point, it'll never appear on these tables as a success because that's not what we designed these tables for, and that's okay, right? I don't think that we have to force it into one of these boxes. We've produced a thing that's better than anything I've ever even heard of existing in real life. We should just give them what they need to keep doing it and then step away slowly.
Can I just double click on your I just wonder if we are sort of trying to put a square peg in a round hole by insisting that VCs be the place where we go to for capital. Maybe we should kind of listen to them, and they're telling us we want certain types of companies to invest in. And those kind of companies are not the kind of companies that are going to fundamentally change healthcare, and they're going to serve the communities we're trying to serve. Maybe there'll be a one-off like CityBlock, an exception to the rule. But if you look at the overwhelming amount of healthcare VC dollars, they don't flow that way. And maybe we should accept they never will. That's not the model that works. And we've got to brainstorm and find other sources of capital. And we talked in our group about patient capital. And two quick examples, and I'll shut up. One is New Mexico. The city of New Mexico has a sovereign wealth fund, and what they're doing in Mexico, they get it from oil, and they're investing in long-term solutions. For instance, I think it's the first state to have universal preschool. That's what they're spending. They're investing in the future of New Mexico. That's an example of a big fund, sovereign wealth fund. Another example is not sovereign wealth, but just a big fund, CalPERS in California. $500 billion. This is the public employees investment fund. They've had sustainability goals and other kind of goals where they invest in certain things, but I think if we could find opportunities to work with large funds that are patient, that they would see Pulse as a good investment. They wouldn't expect it to get a 10x return in 5 years. They invest for 15 and 20 years. They're not looking for 10x. 3x would be fine for a portion of their portfolio. So all I'm saying is maybe we just have to stop hitting our head against the wall of VC and just accept that they're not our cup of tea for some of what we want to do, yes, but for a lot of what we want to do that's transformative, that we're never going to get there if we depend on VC funding. We got to find other sources.
I think to your point exactly, I think first of all, it's just like the real thing is measuring by impact and not lumping everything under one VC, not lumping everything under one category. We have to accept the fact that there will be diversity and different interests in how people want to invest. But we just care that we have a pool that supports in healthcare investment by impact, not investment by where the money is flowing in to just be having more devices and just having more clients. Although the clients can be reflecting real metric of real impact, but you just need to show that correlation. You need to show that it's improving on the patient and the provider side. And generally, I think anyone who would invest in not everyone, but who would invest in healthcare, it's a big chunk of revenue, but also people are incentivized to do something good for society. People are not incentivized to necessarily be in healthcare just because they want to make the revenue. So we have to kind of capitalize how our moral on doing good and human society impact should shape the way we think about important questions related to impact, and maybe having the earlier conversations with VCs on how are they having a model of assessing impact, because they have seen exactly the model from Quality Catalysts and others invest in Chicago, for example, and in certain community settings where they know their investment is not going to return until 10 years down the line. So there's different models, and maybe it's helpful for us to kind of be more specific on which models are we talking about and which models we're targeting the conversation to.
So I'm going to build on everybody something that we discussed in Group 5 and pushing back on my initial point. So having been in both sides of the equations, being a serial entrepreneur, raising tons of money, and also being on the bank side with venture funds and corporate venture with us, is the analogy we use here, which I love to use, is dating. This is a dating game. So you gotta know where to look for money, and you gotta really make sure, I'm using your thesis, but with more kind of plain language. We gotta make sure that our communities understand that it's not all about VCs. VCs are one type of source of funding. There's a lot of people that could be more patient, that they have different horizons. I mean, in the case of the second company, a corporate venture capital fund, somebody who wants to learn from them, who are willing to stay the long term, would have said, don't take that second job. I know you're gonna run out of money. We wanna learn about you. We're gonna fund you because we also gonna get you clients because we could be one of your largest clients. So part of the empowerment that I guess we need to come up, hopefully after these 2 days here in the workshop, that I encourage is just to diversify from those tags. We talk about labels. This is a label that and I know I don't want to insult our hosts. We love you guys, but there's many sources, and entrepreneurs need to figure out, okay, what's the best match? And you're doing yourself a favor, you're doing the community a favor, you're doing the VCs a favor, and the LPs a favor, because you're not trying to your point, saying, okay, I want to do this, help the community, but I need 5 or 10 years. And they say, nope. My LPs saw the guy next door, and they want an exit really quick, and they want 10x or 100x or 1000x. So that is something that hopefully we get to help our community to move away from only looking at one and just going into it. Are they good or bad, or how come they don't see the impact that we do? They do see it, but the incentives are different. So hopefully.
I just wanted to add to that conversation. I think because it's the first workshop, but the way that the question is framed assumes the problem is with capital and how it flows. But think about this. In the beginning, Nina mentioned that U.S. healthcare spends the most out of all OECD countries. We also have the biggest, most efficient capital market in the world. At the same time, this whole time is the worst outcome. So is capital really the problem, or what is the problem? So I just want to throw that out there.
Something definitely important to think about and challenging. And I don't know if we'll have the solutions at the end of the 2 days, but you're absolutely right. Like I think looking to find one source of the problem that's not going to solve the problem. But I do know food is ready downstairs. So let's break out for lunch and keep these conversations going and pick up afterwards.